So I thought what I'd do is just do a solution safari. So the next 7 minutes, I'm going to just go through, you've already heard some solutions. I'm just going to throw out some more because in a moment, we're going to take a moment to think about what are the things that we can do. So these might trigger some ideas for you about how we can take action for lighter living. So what we're learning is that we're all influencers. So Greta actually said that the point of not flying for her was not only reducing her carbon footprint, but to send that signal that Jenny was just speaking about, that the climate crisis is a real thing and to build the political movement. In fact, a colleague of ours, Kate Power from the KR Foundation, she says we're always either contributing to the shift to sustainable living or reinforcing the status quo through our words, our lifestyles, our civic participation. It's not possible to switch off our influence. So there's 3 things I think we can think about in terms of these solution spaces. These high impact solutions, shifting from this thought of us being consumers to really looking at living, at life, and scaling smart. So when we prioritize high-impact solutions, One Earth worked with the United Nations on a report you have at the back there on sustainable lifestyles, options, and opportunities across all the domains. We looked at the highest footprint reducing areas, so these areas that we thought were the most effective in getting the scale of change we've just been speaking to. So, of course it's important to do local food and seasonal food. If we're looking at the energy or footprint reductions, wasted food and plant-rich diet are just the higher more effective for doing that, but we could use local food and seasonal food to bring people into that conversation. But we just want to make sure we keep the numbers in front of us. We can do that for food, and we actually give lists of things you can do inspired by actions around the world. For example, circulating a pledge, but also supporting people to plan meals and shop smart. You can look at those suggested actions that you can do by yourself or with a group across all of these areas. And this is another initiative very similar to that called the Anatomy of Action, which is about cumulative outcomes of our actions as citizens. They do food, goods as stuff, moving, money, fun as leisure. And they have some really cool ways of talking about it, like protein swaps or fashion slowdown or staying curious as a part of leisure and enjoying the journey, right? So it's beyond just the footprint inducing things, but also the things we're going to be moving towards. And you can find Anatomy of Action on the UN website. We'll make sure these slides get sent out, by the way, to the emails that were here so you can get all these references. You also need to link these actions together across the lifestyle domains. So in the sustainable lifestyles, we looked at leisure and general sustainable lifestyles actions. Think about celebrations. They're not just about food, they're also about the goods that we have there, how we celebrate together. Is it a consumer-focused aspect? Or are you doing things like Zero Waste Iftar Challenge, where they're really looking at how they're celebrating, but also speaking about their connection to the earth as part of the process of this celebration, or shifting the way we do weddings to really think about all the ways that celebrating can really shift and become a signal for new norms. So maybe that's something you'll be committing, like a different way to celebrate. And we're also, what we're learning is that let's focus on collectives, as Bill and Jenny and Rio were speaking to. So in the Sustainable Lifestyles work, we also put out a workplace version of the options. Jim Boothroyd is here, who brought his neighbors together for a 12% reduction in their footprint in a year, just by bringing people together to find solutions. Dagmar, my sister, as well as Cor Halsworth and a number of others, Vancity included, have been moving forward on One Planet Saanich, a really integrative with businesses, governments, schools, all coming together to achieve one planet living. A couple of people coming to the city for the Eco City World Summit are 3 people, Marcus Taro, Sari Lane, and Anu Manti, who did a Finnish sustainable everyday life. They involved thousands of Finnish people in looking at 100 smart ways to be sustainable. And they looked across all sorts of things from buying a piece of old growth to spending a year as a vegetarian. They figured out that if 2.6 million households in Finland, if 2 people only reduce their footprints by 20%, they get to 73% of the Finnish national goal around the Paris Agreement, which is still not far enough, as we know, but it's really interesting that they found that it's, even just 20% reductions. And what they also started building together with Ryu as well is this puzzle where you figure out what you need to change in your own life or in your neighborhood, and then you lay it out across a 20-30 timeline. So you might not have to do all of it at once. You could figure out what actions you're going to take and then spread them out over this timeline. And this puzzle is going to be something we'll be putting online. And we have to think about why we consume, because it's really about our identity, right? If you can recognize a hipster from a far distance because they have a certain way of things that they consume and they signal who they are to the world, right? So we have to think about this as well, about our identity and how these things are tied together, but also the societal contexts and habits and social practices. Actually, 40% of what we do is habitual. And it's dynamic and changing across a day, but also across our lives. So if we look at our lives, if we're young or further along in our lives or nearing the end of life, we have these different habits that have happened over time. But there's also moments where we have life transitions, which could be these opportunities where people's habits are already in flux, when they're moving, when they're immigrating to a new place, when they're having a baby, when they're going into retirement. These are powerful moments to actually shift our consumption and production systems and our lifestyle choices. And we have all sorts of new allies, career counselors, wedding and event planners, immigrant welcomers, people who support end-of-life hospice. These are all our allies in shifting ourselves to sustainable lifestyles. This is kind of a pretend future sustainable practice for a city that's welcoming newcomers. So what we're learning is we also need to shift our social practices, the things we see as being normal, and look to traditional practices. Like, why do we shower every day? This is an agreement we have culturally. Even pigs are in on it. No, I'm kidding. But basically, we have these things that we just agree to, right? And so why do we do that? And we can start asking questions about what is seen as being normal. Paul Hawken is coming on Tuesday night to speak at the EcoCity World Summit. He did Project Drawdown to look at the biggest things we can do to reduce our carbon footprints. Look, refrigeration is number one. By the way, notice number 6 and 7 are educating girls and family planning, often areas we need to focus more on when we think about shifting to sustainable futures. Let's look at refrigerants and social practices. And I'll draw on my colleague Marilyn Sahakian from the University of Geneva, who looked at air conditioning in the Philippines. Now, typically, people who lived in elite houses from the 19th century used to sleep on beds like this, but now they sleep under duvets, right? And that's only possible because of air conditioning. If you look at this gentleman, he's very proud to show off his air conditioner. He's the only one in his community that has one. They used to build for the climate. This is brise soleil, so it was like an overhang so that you really didn't get the heat of the sun. But now west is best is the new practice, right? Eco-efficient buildings and only lead to these kinds of rebound effects. So if they become really efficient, you end up getting more rebound effects. But what about passive cooling in the Philippines? How can you get to more of that? And if you look at fashion and seasonality, these are actual magazines from the Philippines that are encouraging that wealthy individuals could wear wool clothing and sit by the fire in the Philippines for Christmas. And that leads to work attire being focused on much warmer clothes than would be necessary. And so air conditioning needs to happen. So social practice theory can help us think about how we can change the social-cultural dimension, the material dimension, and our dispositions behind the things we see as normal. We can also look to traditional practices. Here's Akansha Chowdhury's work from Cuts International looking at energy-efficient buildings in India. There's a new movement to mud houses again amongst the wealthy. Sharing economies has been around for ages in many of these countries. But also look at these alternatives to air conditioning from other eras, from 1772, that we can go back to, or these multi-cool clay refrigerations, which are actually perfectly fine for most of the things we need refrigerated. So we have a lot of these practices we can come back to as well, and that's just ones from overseas. Let's look to the First Nations here to see what kinds of practices and traditions we can draw on, which Janice, of course, was speaking to. We need to shift policy, markets, and media. Nicole is here in the room. She's looking at, with myself and Lewis and the One Earth team and Detlef van Vuren from the Utrecht University, putting lifestyle options into national government climate models. So when they choose their solutions, they look at the demand side as well as the supply side of changing mobility. We did a toolkit for cities on a sustainable consumption, what city governments can do, and enterprises are getting into things like the share, reuse, repair world. Rosie Cooper is here, who is the lead coordinator for this, as well as Louise Schwartz from Recycling Alternative. Vancity is part of this. It's a group of us working on shifting share, reuse, repair in this area, in this region, and the innovations and markets that need to shift. So finally, quickly, the consuming to living. We need to link footprints to well-being, because our well-being doesn't come from the stuff we have. It comes from our engagement in the world, our sense of self-efficacy fueled by trust. Humans gain life satisfaction from doing things together, especially for others. The Vital Sign Vancouver Foundation report just came out that said the majority of BC is already volunteering, is already out working for a cause or charity. How do we build on that? Sustainable ways of living are also deeply diverse. So here's from a sustainable lifestyle scenario, what Inka does in Finland and how she gets her footprint down is going to be very different from Tomas in Hungary. And the China New Dream project is really looking at moving away from the West is best and creating a new Chinese dream of the future that's reimagining prosperity, reframing sustainability based on Chinese values and norms. It's targeting the Chinese consuming class, and it's looking at attainable aspirations for them, but also doing that through storytelling, catalyzing and curating, and this great actionable steps called Dream in a Box. Finally, scaling smart. The change we're talking about has to happen really rapidly. So how do we do it rapidly and also achieve one of the biggest goals, which is doing it justly? This is about transforming our systems of power and privilege. We have to address this as a political movement, and it's really about highlighting the interests of those who are resistant to change and bringing up those who are vulnerable populations and those that have much deep knowledge about how to shift things in a more sustainable and just way. That all of our solutions need to be inclusive from the start, and they also need to be thinking about both overconsumption and those who are under-consuming. So for example, the Climate Justice Alliance talks about this just transition, which is not just about being waste-free, but the transition itself is just and equitable, redressing past harms and creating new relationships of power for the future through reparations. If the process is not just, the outcome will never be. So the just transition looks at how we're going to get there, and it creates this from an extractive economy to really thinking about this regenerative economy. We're also learning that transformations can be rapid. The Rapid Transition Alliance, a movement that you can join, looks at how movements around the world are actually quite rapidly shifting, the way Jenny was speaking to. It looks at past efforts to change quickly, like wartime efforts, antibiotic resistance, changing diet, the LGBTQ movement, the Me Too movement, and the many elements that lead to rapid transitions. And they found we're actually quite good at adapting to rapid change. But the fairness matters, and public leadership is needed as well as agitation, and there's no one path. We have to be bold and also connect our actions to reasons, because the inaction costs and seemingly hard choices can seem, that's what kind of pushes us along. And creating boundaries, saying this is the boundary of what we need to do, it needs to be just within the Earth's life support systems and increase well-being, that sparks innovation. So you can see in some places this is leading to these changes. Finally, what we're learning is that how we communicate matters. We did a project with the UN about how to actually talk about sustainable lifestyles. We have to start from engaging those stakeholders that we're working with in participatory, relevant, and grounded ways to focus on aspirations and connect them to these clear goals. One Earth and IGES is working together on bringing transformative communications together through a beacon for sustainable living. And that links to the fact that this is a deeply cultural change. So we need to engage the power of story, to ask the question why, and to scale deep to the cultural changes that will really lead to this larger legacy shift that we need to take. So that's where I leave you, with dreaming about the future, and my colleague Blake Robinson's dream of this shantytown in South Africa. And he asked, what could it look like in 2040? And he put forward an image of, with Carl Schulschenk, of what is currently being proposed as the future of the city, of that area. Yes, there's sharing economy, but do you see also the great inequality and the militarization that's happening, the kind of big police state? But what if it was a deeply African vision of what the future could look like? And so they took from all sorts of different aspects, from local economy solutions to the kinds of big shifts in mobility and transportation and biodiversity increases that are needed. And what's interesting is right after this image came out, people started painting these zebra crossings across South Africa. So if we can imagine what sustainable living could look and feel like, we can create it. And so we're also doing a project on envisioning future low-carbon lifestyles with IGES. The opportunity is to imagine these futures, but the challenge is that our futures are limited. We see this, Blade Runner, The Road. We need to move beyond these dystopic visions, these technocentric visions. This is a classic view of a city, like a helicopter view, you know, the smart city, the idea of this smart nation, and that's the way that we're going to move forward. Or a lack of imagination. You know, this image is from the UK, and look at this one from a re-envisioned New York. You put them beside each other, and it's kind of a very similar image of what a future could look like. So what if we have an explosion of imagination of what life and sustainable futures could look like? So we're coming out with a report later this year, and we're looking at these principles for guiding this visioning. And here's a sneak peek of some of the things we're starting to envision, like highly connected rural areas, new jobs like sustainability mediators. Perhaps we're all part-time employees and part-time producers of our food. What if education was vastly different? What if we were all part-time city caretakers? And how are we actually going to look at the end of life as part of our sustainable living futures? So when you're thinking about your commitments, think about high-impact areas, link them together, shift those habits, join together for collective action, embrace diverse ways of living, transform power and privilege while lightening lives, challenge our institutions and structures, and mostly also reimagine our sustainable daily lives.